Today's episode is about a city in northern Ontario. It's called Thunder Bay, and it's around 1,500 kilometers from my home in London, Ontario. An exciting thing for Thunder Bay this year is that they hosted the Ontario Games, which is a sports competition for young athletes. Thunder Bay is also the sunniest place in eastern Canada, reportedly receiving over 22 hours of sunlight every year. It's got tons of draws for the nature lover. For instance, it's surrounded by Lake Superior, the world's largest freshwater lake. A good old Canadian hockey city, too, eh? No, but seriously, Thunder Bay has produced the largest number of professional hockey players per capita than any other city. And not just any other city in Canada. No, it's any other city in the world. But like any place, Thunder Bay has a dark side. Among the extra long sunny days and the beautiful land is a history of systemic racism, a history of collusion and inappropriate fraternizing among city officials and police, and a history of violence. You ready, squad? Let's get into today's episode. I am in London, Ontario, and I acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewauk, and Attawandaron peoples. I acknowledge the treaties that are specific to this area. The Two-Row Wampum Belt Treaty of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Silver Covenant Chain, the Beaver Hunting Grounds of the Haudenosaunee Nanfan Treaty of 1701, the McKee Treaty of 1790, the London Township Treaty of 1796, the Huron Tract Treaty of 1827 with the Anishinaabe, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom I recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to society. I hold all that is in the natural world in the highest esteem and give honor to the wonderment of all things within creation. I am grateful for the natural gifts in this world, and I encourage everyone to be faithful to the natural laws of creation. We must acknowledge and respect the relationships. The relationship to the land, where we are the custodians and caretakers for the next generations. The relationship to the water. Water is life. The relationship to the water carriers, the women who hold the sacred teachings about the water. The relationship with the plants that help us live and sustain us with food and medicines. The relationship with all our relations, the four-legged, the hooved, the winged. All the ones that walk, swim, and crawl, and the teaching that we are not above creation. We are a sacred part of creation. The relationship with Mother Earth, who nurtures and sustains us all. Without her, we could not be here. Thunder Bay was colonized in the 17th century. The Indigenous peoples of Thunder Bay include Anishinaabe and Ojibwe, and with colonization, Métis. The Ojibwe people called their land Anamiki, meaning thunder. When the French arrived, they called it Baie de Tonnerre, translated as Thunder Bay. This is how Thunder Bay got its namesake. For those of you who aren't well versed in Canadian geography, Northern Ontario is massive. It's around 417 kilometers squared. For American listeners, that's around 203,000 miles squared. And yet, a lot of the north of Canada is uninhabited. There are only 232,000 people living in Northern Ontario, and of that figure, around 110,000 of them live in Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is actually the most populous city in Northwestern Ontario. Just for perspective here for a second, because if you're like me, these numbers really don't say anything until something of relevance is compared to them. Toronto, Ontario is only 7,126 kilometers square or 4,426 miles square. And yet you're looking at a population of around 6 million people. 6 million in Toronto alone. When it comes to small towns, it seems like the smaller the pool of people, the higher the corruption. Or am I just making that up because it sounds good? I mean, it makes sense to me. Small cities, small pool of influential people, everyone knows everyone, and it isn't a far stretch to say small cities take care of their own. Meaning, maybe when the high school football player gets drunk and crashes his car, they look the other way and don't give him something on his criminal record. Maybe I watch too much TV, who knows? There's actually a fantastic podcast called Thunder Bay, created by Canadaland. I listened to this when it first came out, and I've actually only listened to season one, so I am pumped to see there's 3 seasons now, and I can't wait to dive right back in. I recommend you give it a listen. You'll see what I mean when I talk about corruption in Thunder Bay. If you've been following Canada's recent historic revelations regarding our sordid history of abuse of Indigenous peoples and attempts at cultural genocide, you probably know the various realities coming to light. Residential schools and the horrors that occurred there, the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were removed from their homes and given to white families where they were often mistreated, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two Spirit individuals, the list goes on. Systemic racism is alive and well in the majority of Canada, and Thunder Bay isn't exempt. In fact, Thunder Bay has come into the spotlight a lot over the last several years. From just 2021 to 2023, Thunder Bay's police force has faced suspensions of both a police chief and deputy police chief. The police chief ended up retiring before his accusations could be proven in court. The deputy police chief was reinstated. A 200-page report was generated by an expert panel that focused on the majority of trust issues and morale concerns within the police force and civilians. A number of human rights complaints have been filed by not just Thunder Bay police officers, but also members of the public. If you ask the locals, though, they'll tell you this racism has been going on since the beginning. In the early 1990s, Indigenous people living in Thunder Bay have brought forward allegations that the Thunder Bay Police Service seemingly doesn't care to give thorough investigations to the deaths of Indigenous people. After starting a grassroots committee to document their concerns with over 30 suspicious deaths of Indigenous individuals, the committee began a petition asking for federal intervention and review of Thunder Bay Police. This never went anywhere. That is until 2016, when the Office of the Independent Police Review Director received complaints about how the investigation was handled in the 2015 death of Stacey DeBungy, an Indigenous man. This time, somebody was listening, and a full investigation and review of the Thunder Bay Police Service would be conducted. You can read the full report online, including the context of the investigation's conclusions and recommendations. I'll include it in the sources for this episode. But I definitely want to make sure it's known that when it came to racism within the Thunder Bay Police Service, the investigation revealed that police, quote, failed on an unacceptably high number of occasions to treat or protect the deceased and his or her family equally and without discrimination because the deceased was Indigenous, end quote. In other words, yep, racism and racial stereotyping. A big part of how this discrimination manifests within the police department is through generalized ideas about how Indigenous people wind up deceased. And based on these notions, police would be biased in how they investigated the death. If you aren't sure about what this would look like if applied in a real-life example, then be sure to keep listening, because today we're going to cover the stories of Jethro and Curran Strang. It's actually 7 students, which we'll explore in part 2 as well. 7 is a lucky number in Western culture. Imagery comes to my mind of a slot machine landing on all 7s with the telltale ding, ding, ding that you've won the jackpot. In Thunder Bay, though, this group of 7 First Nations youth would lead to a coroner's inquest and, over the years, would continue to unravel the tightly wound web of racism and corruption. We've talked about how vast Northern Ontario is and how sparsely populated it is. There are more than 75 Northern First Nations in remote reservations in Northern Ontario, but the availability of education, jobs, and healthcare is as sparse as the population. Because of this, Indigenous people move to Thunder Bay to find work, get access to healthcare, and obtain high school education. Many teenagers are sent to Thunder Bay to complete their education. In fact, when it comes to schooling, children on reserve are funded by the government at $2,000 less than a child who goes to school off reserve. This is clearly a major inequity, one that essentially denies Indigenous children on reserve what every other child in Canada has. Imagine for a moment you live in a very isolated community. Around the age of 14, you're sent to a big city hundreds of kilometers away so you can continue your education. The city is so different from what you have back home. Back home, you're surrounded by forests, lakes, and you may not have much in terms of money, clothes, and food, but what you do have is family, and that bond carries you through in most cases. The city, by comparison, is loud and has more people than you've ever seen in one place before. It has different smells, sights, and sounds than you're used to. You're sent to live in a boarding house, often where there are other teenagers from other reserves like you. More often than not, the family who runs the boarding house doesn't really seem to care if you exist or not, just that they receive the extra money for taking you in and giving you a place to stay while you go to school. How lonely does this sound? These kids are completely uprooted and forced to adapt completely to new surroundings. Jethro Anderson did just that. He came to Thunder Bay from Casabonica Lake First Nation, an OG Cree nation. Jethro was born in 1985 and was 14 years old when he was shipped off to Thunder Bay, 600 kilometers away from his home, to attend Dennis Franklin Cromartie High School. On October 1st, 2000, Jethro would turn 15 years old. And just 28 days later, he would go missing. A photograph of Jethro shows a young, handsome man with strong features. His eyes are large and dark, his lips full. In the photograph, he wears a Nike baseball hat and a calm expression. Jethro was lucky. He was welcomed with open arms into his Auntie Dora's home in Thunder Bay. His cousin Nathan, 2 years his senior, lived in the home also, and the two were very close. Jethro had lived with his auntie and uncle since he was a young boy when his mother and father started having marital problems. Jethro loved his family and was a good kid. He never missed a curfew. His auntie and uncle were happy to take him in when he came to Thunder Bay to continue schooling, so Jethro did avoid the boarding house situation. He had a gentle nature and a kind soul, and according to memories shared by his family, he had a really special connection with animals. When he was 6 years old, he found an owl in the bush, and it quickly became his friend. It must have been a sight to see a little boy walking around the reserve with an owl perched on his arm. On October 2000, Jethro and Nathan wanted to go to the mall to hang out and told Dora that's what they had planned to do. Dora, trusting them because she had no reason not to, went to work and then called to check in around 9 p.m. that evening. Nathan, who had answered the phone, admitted that Jethro wasn't home and the pair had separated earlier in the day. He expected Jethro would be home soon, before the 10 p.m. curfew at the very least, because he always came home before curfew. When Dora's shift ended, she drove home, getting there around 11 p.m. A feeling of dread washed over her when she realized Jethro was still not home. This was when Nathan confessed to his mother that instead of going to the mall like they had originally told her, he and Jethro had actually gone to their cousin Leanne's house to drink alcohol. The afternoon was spent with Leanne and some friends, but Nathan left at one point to head to the mall to see a girl. The last glimpse of Jethro was when Nathan was looking at the window of the bus on the way to the mall. Jethro was simply walking on the sidewalk, destination unknown. He didn't seem in distress, though. He just seemed normal. Dora had a bad feeling, and she and her husband, Jethro's Uncle Tom, instructed Nathan to check with friends as well as places they'd normally hang out to see if Jethro was out somewhere and just maybe didn't realize the time. Then Dora and Tom drove around looking for Jethro in their neighborhood. After 4 hours of fruitless searching, the couple went home. It was 3 a.m., and the panic was ramping up. Where could he be? Dora decided it was time to engage the police. The response from the officer who answered the phone? Quote, "He's just out there partying like every other native kid," end quote. Dora heard a click and realized the officer had actually disconnected the call. Determined, Dora began contacting Jethro's parents, who were still on reserve, and then called the police again. This time, she was told it was too early to file a missing persons report. At school, Jethro had made a friend named Shawan. Both were in the same grade, and both had come from reserves far away from the big city of Thunder Bay. On the night of October 28th, the night Jethro didn't come home, they were partying together with other teens at a popular meetup place on the docks of the Cam River. Shawan recalls he last saw Jethro, and when he saw him, he seemed to be pretty drunk. He was hanging out with two girls who were seemingly fighting over him. The friends Shawan was with wanted to leave, so they did. That was the last time Shawan saw Jethro. After more searching by Dora and Tom the morning of October 29th, they'd had enough. They went into the police department to file a missing persons report. Police still maintained their attitude that Jethro was just partying and would surely come home when the party was over, but Dora knew better. Apparently, police didn't even post publicly about Jethro's disappearance until November 5th, a week after the official missing persons report had been filed. Every day, Dora would continue to search for Jethro, coming up empty-handed. By this time, police had found Jethro's FUBU baseball cap, and this continued to instill panic in Dora. Something wasn't right. So why did it seem like police still weren't taking things seriously? Finally, on November 10th, a search of the Cam River began. The work was hard, physically and emotionally. Searchers worked in the bitter cold to drag the river, coming up with nothing on day one. But on day two, November 11th, Remembrance Day in Canada, Dora was contacted to go to the high school where a command post had been set up. She entered the auditorium to find it was packed with students, searchers, members of the community, family members. And that's when the worst fear of everyone was confirmed. Jethro was found, but he wouldn't be coming home. The river had produced Jethro's lifeless body. And perhaps the final blow to an already shattered family was that Thunder Bay police weren't the ones to deliver the news to Dora. Dora, who was Jethro's guardian. Dora, who contacted police multiple times to try to file the missing persons report as well as follow up on leads. Dora, who demanded something be done to find her nephew. Thunder Bay Police instead issued a press release on November 11th indicating a body had been found in the river and they assumed it was Jethro's, though he hadn't yet been positively identified. The press release concluded by saying that Thunder Bay Police Service did not believe foul play caused Jethro's death. Dora knew this was bullshit. Jethro simply did not fall into the water and drown. In fact, Jethro was afraid of water. Dora suspected there was much more to the story and started making waves demanding to see an autopsy report and Jethro's body. She went to the funeral home and demanded the funeral director show her the body, even though it was going to be a closed casket funeral. The funeral director relented, and when Dora saw Jethro laying still in his casket, the first thing she noticed was a large gash on his head and face. He had wounds that looked like someone had stubbed cigarettes out on his face. It was what she didn't see that alarmed her, and that was the fact that he didn't seem bloated from water ingestion. He didn't have the regular signs of drowning of someone who was submerged in the water for a long period of time. In Dora's mind, it was clear this was not an accident. The problem, of course, was that police didn't see any reason to continue to investigate. Jethro drowned accidentally. End of story. Tanya Talaga's book, Seven Fralled in Feathers, details a lot of what is wrong in Thunder Bay. The book is primarily about the 7 Indigenous youths that tragically died in Thunder Bay and the injustices suffered by the Indigenous population in the city and surrounding reserves. Interestingly, there may be an explanation for what happened to Jethro, but it is purely speculation and has never been proven. Apparently, 2 years after Jethro was found in the river, his cousin Nathan was at a bar drinking when he was told there was some guy at the bar talking about Jethro. When Nathan went up to the man outside the bar, he was reportedly crying and said, quote, "I am sorry I am sorry I am sorry what I did to your cousin," end quote. He never revealed this to police and revealed his reason why during the inquest. He didn't tell police because he didn't trust them. Pikangikum First Nation is a community in northern Ontario, accessible only by flight in. Among the beauty of the landscape, which is rich with forestry and a gorgeous lake, is a trail of desperation and loss. It's been suggested that Pikangikum has the highest suicide rate in the world. Like many First Nations reserves, there is a lack of federal funding, leading to horrific living conditions. There is a lack of housing, employment, and resources. 80% of the homes in the PIC don't have the luxury of running water. The trauma of just trying to make a life in the isolated community has given way to addiction issues and, unfortunately, a number of suicides among young people. The rates of loss due to suicide were featured in national newspaper articles and even Maclean's magazine. I was only able to find data as of 2016, and the numbers are shocking. There have been approximately 100 deaths by suicide since the 90s, mostly by youth under the age of 18. To put this into perspective, the population in 2011 was approximately 2,400 residents, and the rate of suicide at that time was equivalent to 250 deaths per 100,000 people. This is one of the highest figures in the world. Why is this happening? The Ontario Coroner's Office launched an inquest into these deaths when the toll reached 16 suicides between 2006 and 2008. Sadly, the majority of victims were younger than 15 years old. Many of them had difficult family lives and were surrounded by substance abuse and domestic violence. And they all chose to end their lives by hanging. The majority of them had experienced a triggering event, such as the suicide of a friend or family member, or being dumped by their romantic partners. Curran Strang lived in the PIC and, like most of the residents, spoke Ojibwe. This meant kids from the reserve who came to Thunder Bay tended to have a difficult time fitting in and stuck together instead, where they could speak freely and comfortably. Curran left his home in 2003 to go to school in Thunder Bay. He was sent to live at a boarding house, which was obviously a huge adjustment having come from an isolated community struggling with poverty. And as can only be expected, Curran had a difficult time settling into his new surroundings. A photograph of Curran shows a young boy not unlike Jethro Anderson. He has a round face, plump lips, and dark almond-shaped eyes. There is a sadness in his eyes that I can feel just by looking at the picture. To cope with increasing loneliness, Curran began to hang out with kids he knew from Pikangikum. These kids liked to party, and Curran was all for finding ways to numb the emotional pain. After all, as I touched upon already, there is an alarming number of suicides where Curran grew up, and he wasn't unscathed by loss. His best friend had committed suicide, followed closely after by another friend and one of his cousins. Curran tried to maintain a positive outlook, though, and he made a friend in another boy named James. James was also Indigenous, but he didn't party. He instead focused on his faith in Christianity, something Curran had been raised with. James tried to be a positive influence on Curran, taking him to church on Sundays and offering an ear to listen if needed. After all, Thunder Bay would prove to be a huge major culture shock for anyone who came from neighboring reserves. They would come from a community of people just like them to a city that made it known they weren't wanted. And it wasn't done with any kind of subtlety. In both the Thunder Bay podcast by Canada Land and the book Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga, there are tales of horrific acts, such as being egged by white kids, being called racial slurs regularly, and even the horrible practice of items like beer bottles or rotted garbage being hurled at Indigenous youth from passing cars. Curran was slipping deeper into trouble as time wore on. He was only 16 years old when he received his first public intoxication arrest with underage drinking tacked on. He was reprimanded according to policy, which included a fine by police and an occurrence report which notified his parents of what had happened. He was also grounded to his boarding house and had a strict curfew to be home by 6 p.m. every night. He was forbidden to use alcohol or drugs and had to be present for all of his classes at school. The downward spiral continued, though, until it was a regular thing for Curran. As an outsider looking in, it's clear Curran was struggling with life. It was a heavy load, and he was just a kid trying to navigate it all. He tried to reach out to the various supports offered by the school, taking advantage of speaking to elders and trying to get his shit together. On Thursday, September 22nd, 2005, Curran broke curfew and hadn't returned home by the morning. Like Jethro Anderson 5 years prior, searchers tried to locate Curran before filing a missing persons report. The last person to have seen Curran was a friend named Adam, who told his boarding parent that he, Curran, and a female had been drinking that night. After an argument, Adam and the female left Curran by a tree around the nearby river. Curran had apparently passed out from being so drunk. The next morning, Friday, September 23rd, Adam had gone back to see if he was still there, where they'd left him. He found Curran's sweater and hat, but Curran wasn't there. A missing persons report was filed, but it was released with glaring errors. Specifically, the date he was last seen was incorrectly captured, and the report spoke of bias when it called Curran a runaway who lived in a foster home. Neither one of those was the truth of the matter. It was only 4 days later, on September 26, 2005, that Curran's body was found in the McIntyre River. He was only 18 years old. His cause of death was ruled accidental drowning, just like Jethro Anderson. Is this likely? It's hard to say. Maybe Curran was so inebriated he went into the water completely unaware he was headed that way. Maybe the shock of the cool river made it so he couldn't focus on swimming back to shore. Or maybe he was thrown into the river to drown simply because some white kids didn't like him for being Indigenous. Either way, there is no evidence to prove either of these theories. Again, listen to Thunder Bay podcast by Canada Land, and you tell me what you think happened. Squad, I think I'm going to end this episode here because this is some really heavy content. Please do stay tuned for part 2 of this special Crime Squad podcast series called Death in Thunder Bay, coming soon. If you or someone you know is experiencing thoughts of suicide, don't go through it alone. Please know there are resources out there. You can call or text 988 in Canada, which will get you support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The support offered is bilingual, trauma-informed, culturally appropriate, and available to anyone in Canada. If you're experiencing mental health or addiction issues and you are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, there's a dedicated line called the Hope for Wellness Helpline. It's available 24/7 and can be reached toll-free at 1-855-242-3310. There is also an online chat option at hopeforwellness.ca. Support is available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut. Be sure to check out at Crime Squad Pod on Instagram for photographs of the victims covered in today's episode. If you like my way of telling Canadian true crime stories, be sure to subscribe to Crime Squad Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, and as always, stay safe and be kind to each other.